The story of the Russian Revolution does not begin with gunfire or banners. It begins in silence, in the cold wind that swept across endless fields of snow, and in the quiet despair of millions of people who had been waiting for change for far too long. For centuries, Russia had been ruled by czars, powerful monarchs believed to be chosen by God. Their word was law, their will unchallenged. The empire stretched across a sixth of the earth's surface, vast, beautiful, and cruel. From the golden palaces of St. Petersburg to the frozen villages of Siberia, inequality was woven into the very fabric of life. At the top stood Tsar Nicholas II, the last of the Romanov dynasty. To his supporters, he was a symbol of tradition, faith, and unity. But to many others, he was a distant ruler, kind perhaps, but blind to the suffering of his people. In the early 1900s, Russia was still largely a land of peasants. Most families lived in wooden huts, surviving on black bread and thin soup. They worked the land from sunrise to sunset, yet owned none of it. The fruits of their labor went to landlords and nobles who lived in comfort, far removed from the toil that sustained them. In the cities, a new class was emerging: factory workers. They labored in harsh, crowded workshops, often for 12 hours a day. The air was thick with smoke, the pay was low, and the rights of workers were nearly non-existent. These were the men and women who would one day march in protest, demanding bread, peace, and freedom. But in the beginning, their voices were whispers, drowned by the grandeur of the empire. Nicholas II ruled with the belief that absolute power was sacred. He was gentle with his family, devoted to his wife Alexandra, and loving to his children. But he struggled to understand the changing world beyond his palace walls. He once said that he would never give up his divine right to rule, no matter how great the storm. And the storm was already forming. In 1905, a group of peaceful protesters marched to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. They carried no weapons, only icons and portraits of the Tsar. They came to beg for help, for food, fair wages, and dignity. But the soldiers guarding the palace opened fire. Hundreds were killed. That day became known as Bloody Sunday. It shattered the faith of the people in their ruler. The Tsar, who had once been seen as a father of the nation, now seemed a stranger, perhaps even an enemy. The years that followed were filled with strikes, arrests, and protests. Nicholas tried to calm the unrest by allowing a parliament, the Duma, to form. But when its members questioned his authority, he dissolved it. Time and again he chose power over reform, until there was no trust left to save. Then came war. In 1914, Russia joined the First World War. At first the people cheered, believing victory would restore the empire's pride. But the war brought only misery. Russian soldiers fought bravely, yet they lacked boots, bullets, and sometimes even bread. Millions died in frozen trenches. Families received letters of loss instead of hope. By 1916, hunger had spread from the front lines to the villages and cities. Bread queues stretched for hours. Mothers clutched their children, whispering prayers. And in the palaces, rumors spread that the Tsarina, under the influence of the mystic Rasputin, was guiding the empire into chaos. The gap between ruler and ruled was never wider. Even within the royal family's circle, doubt grew. Ministers came and went like shadows. Generals questioned the Tsar's decisions. And among the people, one thought began to take root. Perhaps Russia did not need a Tsar at all. The seeds of revolution were sown not by soldiers or politicians, but by hunger, loss, and exhaustion. When faith in leadership disappears, people turn to new ideas and new leaders waiting in the wings. By early 1917, winter hung heavy over Petrograd, the city once called St. Petersburg. Snow covered the rooftops, and the air was thick with the smoke of coal and discontent. Inside cramped apartments, workers huddled for warmth, their bellies empty and their hearts restless. The war had dragged on for 3 long years. Prices had tripled, food was scarce, and wages meant little. Every day, thousands lined up for bread that never came. The empire that once claimed to be eternal now trembled on the edge of collapse. In February 1917, it began, not as a grand uprising, but as a simple protest for food. Women from the textile factories marched through the streets, calling for bread and peace. Soldiers were sent to stop them, but many refused to fire. Some even joined the crowd. The city was no longer under the Tsar's control. Soon the strike spread. The Duma reconvened and declared that the Tsar must step down. For the first time in more than 300 years, the Romanov throne was empty. On March 15, 1917, Nicholas II signed his abdication. The empire that had ruled for centuries ended in a single stroke of a pen. The Tsar's train was halted in the snow, his voice calm but weary as he wrote that he was giving up the crown for the good of Russia. Outside, bells rang, not in celebration, but in disbelief. The people who had once bowed to the Tsar now looked at one another and wondered what would come next. Russia was free, but it was also lost. A provisional government took power, promising elections, liberty, and reform. But it inherited a nation in ruins. The war continued. The soldiers still starved. The peasants still waited for land. The new government wanted democracy, but it also wanted to please its allies in the West. So it chose to keep fighting, a decision that would soon cost it everything. Meanwhile, another power was growing quietly in the background: the Soviets. Councils of workers and soldiers who met in factories and barracks to discuss their own future. Among them was a man who had spent years in exile, watching and waiting: Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Lenin believed that the revolution had only begun. He said Russia needed not reform, but transformation, not a new government, but a new system. In his writings, he called for the end of war, the transfer of land to peasants, and all power to the Soviets. When he returned to Petrograd in April 1917, crowds greeted him with red flags and chants, "Hete!" He stepped off the train and declared that the time of compromise was over. The people, he said, must seize their destiny. His words were fire to a nation of embers. The provisional government tried to hold on, but its authority weakened by the day. The army was divided. The people were angry. The Bolsheviks, Lenin's party, grew bolder. By the summer, strikes and protests filled the streets once more. The revolution had entered a new phase, one that would soon sweep away the last remnants of the old world. But before the storm of October, there was still a moment of fragile hope, a belief that perhaps freedom could exist without chaos, that peace could come without blood. That hope would soon be tested. As Lenin prepared his followers, as soldiers deserted the front lines, and as peasants began to seize land on their own, Russia stood at a crossroads between the world it had always known and the one that it was about to create. The Tsar was gone. The empire was gone. But the question remained: what would rise in its place? By the time 1917 dawned, Russia was a nation standing on the edge of collapse. The great empire that had stretched across continents, proud and vast, was now weary and fragile. Years of war had drained its spirit. Hunger gnawed at its cities. The cold winds of discontent howled through its villages. And beneath the surface, the people's patience, once endless, was finally breaking. In Petrograd, the capital city, long lines of women and children stood before bakeries, shivering in the snow. They waited for bread that rarely came. Inside factories, men toiled endlessly for meager wages, while soldiers at the front faced death, not for glory, but for a Tsar who seemed far away from their pain. It was a moment waiting to explode. The Great War had turned Russia's weakness into disaster. Millions of soldiers died, millions more were left wounded, hungry, and hopeless. Their uniforms were torn, their rifles old. Some fought barefoot in the snow. When they returned home, they brought with them not medals or victory, but stories of hunger, death, and betrayal. Whispers spread through the ranks. Why should we fight for an empire that forgets us? The soldiers no longer feared their officers. The peasants no longer respected their landlords. The workers no longer trusted the Tsar. And then, in February 1917, the storm began. It started not with guns or armies, but with women. On International Women's Day, thousands of factory workers, many of them mothers and wives, poured into the streets of Petrograd. They demanded bread, peace, and dignity. Their cries echoed through the icy air, "Down with hunger! Down with the Tsar!" At first, the police tried to stop them. But the crowd grew. Men joined. Soldiers ordered to fire hesitated. Many refused to shoot their own people. The bond between ruler and ruled was snapping. The protests swelled until the capital itself seemed to tremble. The Duma, Russia's parliament, demanded reform. Ministers pleaded with the Tsar to act, but Nicholas II, far from the capital and blind to the desperation, issued orders to crush the unrest. His words, cold and detached, only deepened the divide. But it was too late. The tide had turned. The soldiers in Petrograd mutinied, joining the people. The old order was cracking from within. By mid-March, chaos filled the city. Crowds stormed government buildings, prisons were opened, the royal insignias were torn down. The once mighty symbol of the Romanovs was fading into history. And then, on a cold March day, Nicholas II, descendant of centuries of autocratic power, was forced to abdicate. The Tsar, who had believed himself chosen by God, now signed his name in surrender. Russia had no Tsar. The empire that had ruled over millions for more than 300 years had fallen in just a few days. The world watched in shock. Newspapers around the globe carried the headlines. The Tsar abdicates. A new Russia is born. But what kind of new Russia would it be? The old world had ended. The throne was empty. Power, for the first time, belonged not to a monarch, but to the people. Yet the people were not united. There were voices, many voices, each shouting for a different future. A provisional government was formed, led by moderates who believed Russia could become a democracy. They promised elections, reforms, and freedom. But outside their offices, in the factories and barracks, other voices were rising, louder, angrier, more revolutionary. They were the Soviets, councils of workers, peasants, and soldiers who believed in power from below. Among them, new leaders emerged. Some were dreamers, others were organizers. And one man, still in exile, was watching and waiting, his ideas sharper than ever, his resolve unbroken. His name was Vladimir Lenin. As spring turned to summer, Russia was alive with both hope and confusion. For the first time in centuries, people felt free to speak. Newspapers flourished, meetings filled the streets, and dreams of a better tomorrow seemed possible. Yet beneath this excitement, chaos brewed. The war still raged. The soldiers, tired and angry, demanded to return home. The peasants wanted land. The workers wanted fair wages and shorter hours. The provisional government promised reforms, but moved slowly. It tried to keep Russia in the war, hoping to honor alliances and preserve dignity. But the people were done with promises. Meanwhile, in exile in Switzerland, Lenin read the news with fiery eyes. He saw that the monarchy had fallen, but the revolution was unfinished. To him, replacing the Tsar with moderates was not true change. He wrote, "No support for the provisional government." His message was simple and radical. All power to the Soviets. End the war. Give land to the peasants. Bread to the hungry. Peace to the people. In April 1917, Lenin made his daring return. Traveling through war-torn Europe in a sealed train, he crossed borders and battlefields to reach Petrograd. When he arrived, thousands gathered to greet him at the station. He stepped out, raised his hand and declared, "The revolution has just begun." Lenin's words electrified the nation. His party, the Bolsheviks, began to spread his message in factories, villages, and army camps. His ideas offered clarity in a world of confusion. We can end the suffering, but only if we take power. By summer, tension filled the air. Demonstrations erupted once again. Workers marched with red banners. Soldiers shouted slogans. Some demanded the government's end. The government called them traitors. The people called themselves patriots of a new Russia. The July days, 3 days of violent protest, shook Petrograd. Blood was spilled, and the government cracked down. Lenin fled to Finland, accused of treason. But even as he hid, his words continued to spread like wildfire. Meanwhile, another figure rose, Alexander Kerensky, a brilliant speaker and ambitious leader, became head of the provisional government. He promised to bring unity and order, yet he faced an impossible storm. The army was disintegrating. The peasants were seizing land on their own. And in the distance, the Bolsheviks were growing stronger. In August, General Kornilov, a conservative army commander, attempted to march on Petrograd, hoping to restore order through force. But his plan failed. Workers and soldiers united to stop him, ironically, with the help of the Bolsheviks. The government's weakness was exposed, and when the dust settled, the people began to ask, if the provisional government cannot lead, who can? Lenin saw his moment approaching. He wrote letters to his comrades from hiding. Now or never. The time has come for the second revolution. By the autumn of 1917, the mood in Russia had changed. The once celebrated provisional government was despised. Factories stood idle. Farmers refused to deliver food. Soldiers deserted in masses. The old order was gone, and the new one was failing. The people wanted someone, anyone, who could bring peace and justice. And Lenin promised both. The storm had broken the empire, but another, greater storm was rising, the one that would remake Russia and change the course of the 20th century. By the autumn of 1917, Russia was a land adrift, free from its Tsar, yet chained by chaos. The provisional government that had promised hope now stood fragile and unloved. The war dragged on, the people starved, factories were silent, and soldiers deserted in thousands. In the streets of Petrograd, whispers turned to cries, peace, land, bread. The Revolution of February had ended the monarchy, but not the misery. The dream of freedom had turned into confusion, and amid that confusion, one movement, small but determined, was preparing to act: the Bolsheviks. They were not the biggest party, nor the most popular, but they had something no one else did: a vision, clear and uncompromising. Under Lenin's leadership, they had built a network of workers, soldiers, and peasants who believed in one truth: real change would not come from speeches or reforms. It would come from action. From his hiding place in Finland, Lenin watched the provisional government stumble again and again. He knew that time was running out, not just for them, but for the revolution itself. The people's faith was fading. Winter was near, and so he decided to return. In early October, under disguise and secrecy, Lenin slipped back into Petrograd. His beard shaved, his clothes worn, he hid in safe houses, meeting his comrades under the cover of darkness. His message to them was urgent and clear. The government is collapsing. The people are ready. The moment to seize power is now. At first, even some Bolsheviks hesitated. "We are not ready," they said. "The people will not follow us." But Lenin insisted. He believed that waiting would mean losing everything. History will not forgive delay, he warned. So plans began to take shape, quietly, methodically. Inside the Smolny Institute, a former school-turned-revolutionary headquarters, maps were drawn, orders were written, and trusted leaders were chosen. The Red Guards, groups of armed workers loyal to the Bolsheviks, were trained and ready. In the army and the navy, Bolshevik influence had spread like wildfire. The soldiers, tired of dying for empty promises, now pledged loyalty to Lenin's cause. And at the center of it all stood another figure, young, fiery, and brilliant, Leon Trotsky. As head of the Petrograd Soviet, Trotsky organized the city's defense, or, as some suspected, its revolution. With speeches that burned through doubt, he united workers and soldiers under one flag, the red flag of revolution. The provisional government, blind to the danger, continued to stumble. Kerensky, still clinging to power, accused his opponents of treason while trying to rally an army that no longer obeyed him. His words fell on deaf ears. As October deepened, the city grew tense. Snowflakes began to fall over Petrograd's silent streets. The river froze. The air smelled of smoke and fear. Rumors spread that the Bolsheviks were preparing an uprising. The government responded by closing down Bolshevik newspapers and arresting some leaders. But it was too late. The machine had already been put in motion. Lenin, in hiding, wrote one final letter to his comrades. "We must not delay. The government is crumbling. Power must pass to the Soviets. The time of words has ended. The time of action has come." And so, on the night of October 24, 1917, as darkness covered Petrograd, the revolution began. It started silently. No thunder of guns, no roaring crowds, only shadows moving through the night. The Red Guards, disciplined and determined, fanned out across the city. They took over bridges, railway stations, and telephone exchanges. Resistance was minimal. Most soldiers simply stepped aside. Many even joined them. At dawn, the key buildings of Petrograd were under Bolshevik control. The Winter Palace, seat of the provisional government, stood as the last symbol of the old regime. Inside, Kerensky's ministers waited anxiously, unaware that history was marching toward them. By evening, the palace was surrounded. The cruiser Aurora, anchored in the Neva River, aimed its guns toward the palace. At 9:40 p.m., a single blank shell was fired, a signal not of destruction, but of destiny. Red Guards and revolutionary soldiers advanced. They entered through doors and windows, climbing staircases lined with chandeliers and portraits of czars long gone. There was confusion, shouting, and the sound of boots on marble. Yet, compared to the revolutions of legend, it was almost bloodless. By early morning, the ministers were arrested. Kerensky had fled. The Winter Palace, once the pride of the Romanovs, now belonged to the revolution. Lenin arrived at the Smolny Institute before dawn. His face, once hidden in exile, now glowed with triumph. Standing before the Congress of Soviets, he announced calmly, "Comrades, the workers' and peasants' revolution has taken place. The provisional government has been overthrown. State power has passed into the hands of the Soviets." The room erupted. Cheers, songs, tears. It was the birth of a new world. The revolution was complete. Without grand speeches or blazing battles, the Bolsheviks had taken power in the largest country on earth. They promised an end to war, land for peasants, and equality for all. But outside the hall, the city was restless. The streets were filled with soldiers, workers, and citizens unsure of what would come next. Some rejoiced, others feared chaos. The world had changed overnight, but not everyone was ready for the dawn. In the days that followed, Lenin's new government, called the Council of People's Commissars, was formed. Decrees were issued swiftly. The war with Germany would end, land would be given to peasants, and workers would control factories. The red banner was raised above government buildings, symbolizing the new order. Yet even as the revolutionaries celebrated, cracks began to appear. Not everyone supported the Bolsheviks. Rival parties, loyal officers, and foreign powers watched with alarm. The revolution had succeeded, but its survival was uncertain. Outside Russia, the world held its breath. Monarchs trembled, workers rejoiced. The age of empires had been shaken by a people's uprising. A message had been sent to every nation. Power could come from below. And within Russia itself, hope and fear walked in hand. The Bolsheviks had promised peace, but would peace be possible in a land torn by hunger and hate? Lenin stood at his window that night, looking out over the silent city. Snow fell softly on the empty streets. He knew the struggle was far from over. The revolution had been won, but the future of the new world was yet to be written. The morning after the October Revolution was cold and quiet. Snow covered the rooftops of Petrograd, but beneath that stillness, the air trembled with uncertainty. Russia had entered a new era, and no one knew where it would lead. The Bolsheviks, once exiles and dreamers, now held the fate of a vast empire in their hands, but power, they soon discovered, was easier to seize than to keep. Across the land, opposition began to stir. The old world was not ready to vanish quietly. Aristocrats, officers, landowners, and even some revolutionaries refused to accept Bolshevik rule. They saw Lenin's new government as chaos disguised as progress. To them, the October uprising had been a betrayal, not liberation. And so, the stage was set for a new and terrible struggle, the Russian Civil War. The war was not fought between two equal armies, but between two ideas. On one side stood the Reds, the Bolsheviks, fighting to defend their revolution and build a new socialist order. On the other stood the Whites, a loose alliance of monarchists, conservatives, liberals, and foreign armies, united only by their hatred of Bolshevism. The map of Russia fractured like ice. Cities and provinces changed hands again and again. From the frozen tundra of the north to the burning plains of the south, chaos reigned. Railways became lifelines. Villages became battlegrounds. In Petrograd and Moscow, Lenin's government issued bold decrees, ending private property, nationalizing industries, and declaring equality for all. But paper promises could not fill empty stomachs. Food grew scarce, and factories lacked materials. Hunger and exhaustion haunted the workers who had once cheered the revolution. Meanwhile, in the countryside, peasants grew restless. They had seized land from landlords, but now faced new demands from the state. Grain was requisitioned for the Red Army. Resistance was met with violence. What had begun as liberation began to feel like another form of control. To survive, Lenin and his comrades turned to discipline, harsh, unyielding, and absolute. They called it war communism. Under war communism, every resource was devoted to the Red Army. Private trade was banned, factories were militarized, and even food became a weapon of war. The Cheka, a new secret police force, was created to crush dissent. Fear became a tool of governance. In towns and villages, whispers of discontent were enough to bring a knock on the door at midnight. Those accused of counter-revolution were often never seen again. It was the beginning of what would later be known as the Red Terror. The Cheka hunted spies, hoarders, and enemies of the revolution. But the definition of enemy kept expanding until anyone who doubted, hesitated, or complained could be branded a traitor. In the name of saving the revolution, mercy became a luxury Russia could not afford. The Civil War soon spread like wildfire. In Siberia, Admiral Kolchak's white armies advanced westward, capturing cities and executing Bolsheviks. In the south, General Denikin's forces pushed toward Moscow. In the north, British and French troops landed to support the whites. From every direction, the Reds were surrounded. But the revolutionaries had two weapons stronger than guns: belief and organization. Leon Trotsky, once an exiled writer, now became the architect of victory. As People's Commissar for War, he transformed the Red Army from a ragtag militia into a disciplined fighting force. Traveling by armored train, Trotsky moved from front to front, inspiring soldiers with fiery speeches and unbreakable will. He told them that the war was not just for power, but for the soul of Russia, for the dream of equality, dignity, and freedom from tyranny. And against all odds, that message worked. The Red Army began to push back. City by city, region by region, the Bolsheviks regained control. They were driven not only by ideology, but by desperation. They knew that if they lost, the revolution would die, and with it, their hope for a new world. By 1919, Russia had become a vast battlefield. Fields once green with wheat were now scarred by trenches. Towns lay in ruins, and famine stalked the countryside. Millions were dead or displaced. Families were torn apart. The whites fought bravely but without unity. Their leaders argued among themselves, and their cause, restoring the old order, failed to inspire a population weary of monarchs and masters. Foreign intervention, meant to crush Bolshevism, only strengthened the Reds' claim that they were defending Russia from outsiders. Lenin's government called it the defense of the revolution. To the people, it became a war for survival. In 1920, the tide turned decisively. The Red Army recaptured Siberia, crushed the southern offensives, and forced the remaining white armies into retreat. One by one, their strongholds fell. The foreign soldiers withdrew, tired and disillusioned. By the end of 1921, the Reds had won. The revolution had survived, but at a terrible cost. The Civil War left Russia shattered. Towns lay empty, railways broken, and farmlands barren. Hunger claimed more lives than bullets. In some regions, entire villages disappeared from the map. But amid the ruins, a new state began to rise, the world's first socialist republic. The victory, however, was not without shadows. The Red Terror had left scars deep and painful. In their pursuit of purity and survival, the revolutionaries had unleashed fear that would echo for generations. The promise of freedom had been entangled with the machinery of control. Even Lenin himself, though firm in his belief, began to see the dangers of absolute power. He spoke of the need for compassion, for moderation, but the momentum of fear was hard to stop. The revolution, once a song of hope, now carried the rhythm of silence and obedience. Yet, for all its pain, the Civil War forged something unbreakable: unity through endurance. The people of Russia had survived the unimaginable. They had endured hunger, violence, and despair. But they had also learned resilience. Factories reopened, railways were repaired, and villages began to rebuild. Life crept back, fragile but persistent. The red flag that flew over the Kremlin was more than a symbol of power. It was a testament to survival. And through it all, the moral of the revolution became clear. Change, no matter how noble, demands sacrifice. Ideals may inspire, but they also test the limits of human compassion. The Civil War had turned dreamers into rulers, poets into soldiers, and a nation into an experiment, one that would define the century to come. As Lenin looked out over land scarred but still breathing, he must have known that the hardest battles were yet to come. The old Russia was gone, but what would replace it, and at what cost, was a question no one could yet answer. The revolution had survived the storm, but the storm had changed it forever. When the guns of the Civil War finally fell silent, Russia was unrecognizable. The land was broken, its villages burned, its cities hollowed, its people exhausted. But through the silence, one question echoed across the vast scarred landscape. What now? The Bolsheviks had survived, yes, but victory had come at a staggering cost. Millions were dead, and famine spread like a shadow across the countryside. The factories that once thundered with life stood silent, their machines rusted. Trains sat idle on frozen tracks. The revolution had won, but the people were starving. In Moscow, Lenin understood the bitter irony. The dream that had promised bread and peace had brought neither. The country was collapsing under the weight of its own ideals. And if the new state was to survive, something had to change. It was in this moment of crisis that Lenin made one of his most difficult decisions, a choice that would shape the future of the Soviet Union. In 1921, he introduced the New Economic Policy, or NEP. It was a sharp turn away from war communism, a temporary retreat to save the revolution from its own extremes. Under the NEP, small businesses were allowed to reopen. Farmers could sell their surplus grain in local markets instead of surrendering it to the state. Private trade returned, cautiously, to Russian streets. It was not capitalism reborn, but a pragmatic compromise, socialism with room to breathe. Lenin called it a step backward for the sake of a great leap forward. For the first time in years, markets began to bustle again. Peasants came to town with sacks of grain and potatoes. Shopkeepers reopened dusty doors. Laughter returned to the sound of the streets. Life was still hard, but it was life again. Factories, too, began to hum with renewed energy. Workers repaired machines, rebuilt railways, and restocked warehouses. Slowly, the economy began to move. Lenin's gamble was working. But the NEP was not without controversy. Many Bolsheviks, hardened by years of war and sacrifice, saw it as betrayal, a surrender to the very system they had fought to destroy. How are we now to welcome the merchants we once condemned, they asked. Lenin's answer was firm. Better a temporary compromise than a permanent collapse. He knew that revolutions die not from betrayal, but from starvation and despair. To save the people, he had to give them hope, even if that meant bending ideology to reality. Yet, as Russia's stomach began to fill, its soul remained restless. The revolution had promised equality and justice, but rebuilding required authority and order.
Local Soviets, councils of workers and peasants began reporting directly to Moscow. Power was centralizing. The Communist Party grew stronger, its control deeper, its voice louder. For the first time, Lenin faced a paradox. The revolution that sought to liberate the people now demanded their obedience. And within the party itself, new rivalries began to form. Among the revolution's heroes, ambition stirred. Trotsky, the brilliant orator and military leader, believed in spreading revolution abroad. Others, like Stalin, argued that the priority was to strengthen socialism at home. The debates were fierce, but for now, Lenin's word was law. Still, his health was failing. Years of hardship, assassination attempts, and sleepless nights had taken their toll. The man who had once commanded crowds with fire in his voice now spoke softly from his sickbed, his body weakened, but his mind unyielding. And as Lenin watched his revolution evolve into a government, he began to see the danger ahead, not from foreign enemies, but from within.
By 1922, a new political structure began to emerge. The various Soviet republics, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Caucasus regions were united under one flag. A new name was born, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. It was a title filled with promise, a union not of conquerors but of equals, a nation born from revolution, guided by the principles of socialism, equality, and unity. Posters declared, "Workers of the world, unite." And for many across the globe, the Soviet Union became a symbol, proof that empires could fall and that the poor could rise. Factories reopened in the cities, and education expanded in the villages. Literacy campaigns reached millions. People who had never held a book now learned to read. Women, long confined by tradition, entered the workforce and the councils, standing shoulder to shoulder with men. Hope flickered again across the weary land. But beneath the progress, the seeds of a new struggle were already being sown. The party's hold on power tightened. Opposition parties were outlawed. Newspapers were censored. Even within the Bolshevik ranks, dissent was seen as disloyalty. Lenin, though cautious, accepted these measures, believing that unity was the only safeguard against collapse. The Cheka, once a wartime necessity, now evolved into a permanent institution of state control. Surveillance and fear lingered like a shadow over daily life. For ordinary citizens, the revolution's ideals of freedom and equality now came with an unspoken warning: obedience before opinion. And yet, despite the growing rigidity, the moral heartbeat of the revolution endured. In schools and workplaces, people still spoke of justice, sacrifice, and collective purpose. Songs praised labor, not luxury. Slogans reminded all that they were building a world for the many, not the few. In December 1922, Lenin suffered his first major stroke. He was 52 years old. The once tireless leader was now confined to a wheelchair, his speeches reduced to brief notes. But even from the sidelines, he watched closely and worried deeply. He saw power consolidating around one man, Joseph Stalin, the party's general secretary. Stalin was efficient, disciplined, and loyal in appearance, but quietly he was building a network of influence. Lenin grew alarmed. In his final writings, he warned the party against the dangers of personal power. He wrote, "Comrade Stalin is too rude, and this defect, though tolerable in our midst, becomes intolerable in a secretary general. I propose to remove him." It was a final act of caution, a plea to preserve the revolution's soul before it was too late. But Lenin would not live to see his warning heeded.
In January 1924, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin died. The news swept through the nation like a winter storm. Factories stopped their machines. People wept in the streets. Workers laid flowers outside the Kremlin walls. To millions, Lenin was not just a leader, he was the revolution itself. His body was embalmed and placed in a grand mausoleum in Red Square, where thousands came to pay their respects. His ideas, his words, and his dream would continue to guide the Soviet Union, but his absence would also open the door to a new kind of power. The revolution had survived monarchy, war, and famine. Now it faced its greatest test, the challenge of its own creation. Lenin's death marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The ideals he fought for, equality, justice, and the power of the people, would remain, but their meaning would soon be reshaped under new hands. For the people of the Soviet Union, it was a moment of reflection. They had built a state from the ashes of empire, endured hunger and terror, and found strength in unity. But the road ahead would demand more than survival. It would demand wisdom, humility, and faith in the human spirit. And as the red banners waved in the cold Moscow wind, one truth became clear. Revolutions do not end with victory. They begin there.
The guns of the Civil War slowly fell silent. After years of unrest, hunger, and bloodshed, the Russian land, soaked with tears and sacrifice, was ready to rebuild. By 1922, Lenin and his followers had achieved what seemed impossible. The old empire of the Tsars was gone. In its place stood a new nation, born from the ashes of revolution, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. It was not merely a new name, it was an entirely new idea, a system that promised to unite workers and peasants under one banner. Factories, farms, and even schools were reorganized to serve the state. The dream was bold, an attempt to erase centuries of inequality and build a classless society. But dreams, no matter how noble, are never simple. The scars of war still marked every field, every home, and every heart. Millions were gone, lost in battle, famine, or disease. Railways were broken, crops were gone, and cities lay half in ruin. And yet, through all this, there was hope. Lenin believed this was just the beginning. He often said the revolution would inspire the world, that oppressed people everywhere would rise and follow Russia's example. He imagined a future where every worker would share equally in the fruits of labor, where no child would starve, and where learning and art would flourish for all. Moscow became the new capital, symbolizing a break from the imperial grandeur of St. Petersburg. The hammer and sickle flag waved above the Kremlin, a simple emblem that spoke to millions, unity between workers and peasants. Every speech, every poster, every song repeated the same promise, a better tomorrow for the common man. Yet, inside the walls of power, not everything was calm. Lenin's health began to fail after an assassination attempt in 1918 left him permanently weakened. By 1922, strokes had confined him to his bed, and the question whispered through the party halls, who would lead after Lenin? Two men began to rise, Leon Trotsky, the fiery revolutionary, and Joseph Stalin, the quiet but ambitious organizer. Trotsky was admired for his intellect and charisma, the hero of the Red Army. Stalin, on the other hand, was patient, strategic, and ruthless when needed. Lenin himself worried about Stalin's growing power, warning the party in his final letters to be cautious. But as fate would have it, his words would not be enough. When Lenin passed away in January 1924,
millions wept. The man who had promised peace, land, and bread was gone. His body was embalmed and placed in a mausoleum, becoming both a symbol of hope and a shadow of the struggles yet to come. Russia now was the Soviet Union. A new era began, but it was one that would test the very ideals the revolution had promised. The Soviet Union's birth was both a triumph and a warning. It showed how powerful ideas could reshape a nation, but also how easily power could change hands, sometimes moving from the few to the few again, even when the goal was equality. After Lenin's death, Stalin began to rise swiftly. He quietly consolidated power, placing his allies in key positions and removing those who opposed him. Trotsky, once the hero of the revolution, was pushed aside, exiled, and eventually hunted down. The dream of shared leadership faded into a single, commanding voice. Factories were rebuilt, fields reorganized, and cities revived, but the cost was heavy. Freedom of speech, the very spark that once fueled the revolution, began to dim. The same revolution that sought to give power to the people slowly became one where the people served power. And yet, beneath the fear and control, the Soviet Union achieved things that amazed the world. Illiteracy dropped, science advanced, and for the first time, millions of ordinary people could read, work, and participate in industries that had once been reserved for the wealthy. Women worked as engineers, doctors, and soldiers. Children learned about technology, art, and space. The dream had changed shape, but it had not completely died. The revolution had planted seeds too deep to erase. Across continents, people watched and wondered, could such a transformation happen elsewhere? Could ordinary people really rewrite history? The world that followed, marked by Cold War tensions, ideological battles, and global change, was a direct echo of what began in Petrograd in 1917. It proved that revolutions do not end with victory. They only begin there. True revolutions continue in the hearts of people, long after the marches and battles have ended. And so, the story of the Russian Revolution stands not just as history, but as a mirror. It shows humanity's endless search for justice and belonging, its courage to dream, and its struggle to learn that power, if left unchecked, can turn even the purest dreams into burdens. From the snowy streets where crowds once shouted for bread, to the halls of the Kremlin where leaders shaped the world's destiny, one truth endures. Change begins with people who dared to believe that tomorrow can be better than today. As the red flag rose above the vast land that once bowed before the Tsar, a new chapter of human history unfolded, one written not with gold and crowns, but with the voices, sweat, and hopes of millions. And even now, more than a century later, that echo still whispers through history. Empires may fall, but the desire for equality and dignity never dies. History is not just about kings or revolutions. It's about us, about what we choose to remember and what we choose to build next. If you've journeyed with us through this story of struggle, faith, and transformation, make sure to subscribe to our channel, because every week we uncover another chapter of humanity's great story, told simply, clearly, and truthfully. Join us and keep exploring the past to understand the future.